In a quiet Asian village, a foreign teacher finds unexpected joy in the bond with a little boy. But when a tragic incident strikes, he's accused of a crime he didn't commit. What unfolds is a tale of betrayal, hidden truths, and the redemptive power of love and kindness. Daniel had always believed that life had a strange way of stitching people together, not with blood or contracts, but with quiet moments and invisible threads. He never expected that one of those threads would lead him halfway across the world, from a cold apartment in Belgium to a sun-drenched village nestled between misty mountains in East Asia. At 35, Daniel was a man with weathered eyes and a gentle smile. He had the kind of presence that made children feel safe and elders feel heard. His clothes were simple, always a worn linen shirt tucked into faded trousers and a pair of thick-framed glasses that constantly slid down the bridge of his nose. He came to the village of Maylin as a volunteer teacher. The school, modest and aging, had only one chalkboard and a handful of desks patched with bamboo strips. The children had never spoken to a foreigner before Daniel, and the first weeks were filled with nervous giggles and wide-eyed stares. But he didn't mind. He was patient. He had time. What he didn't have anymore was a family. Daniel lived in a communal courtyard owned by Mr. Wu, a reserved man in his 50s with skin tanned from years under the sun. Mr. Wu was the unofficial head of the compound, and though he seldom spoke, his eyes held a quiet dignity. His son was the opposite. Lee was 6 years old and endlessly curious. His energy was boundless, like a river in spring. He had short black hair that always stuck up at odd angles, round cheeks flushed with sun, and a laugh that rang through the courtyard like wind chimes. The first time Lee wandered into Daniel's room, he was looking for crayons. The second time, it was for cookies. The third time, he didn't even need a reason. Before long, it became a ritual. Every morning before school, Lee would knock on Daniel's bamboo door with both fists and yell, "Teacher Dan! Teacher Dan!" And every morning, Daniel would open the door with a half laugh and a sleepy grin. It didn't take long before Daniel began setting out an extra bowl of rice porridge, a small cup of soy milk, and a sweet bun topped with sesame, Lee's favorite. To the villagers, it was a curious friendship, the foreigner and the boy. But it warmed their hearts. They had seen Daniel fix Lee's broken sandals with bits of string and carve him a wooden toy car from scraps. They watched him patiently teach the boy to read both Mandarin and English, drawing animals on paper and pointing out each letter with exaggerated delight. "Daniel loves that boy like a son," one old woman murmured as she watched them laugh over a drawing of a lion with a crooked tail. "And the boy? He follows him like a shadow," replied another, nodding. Daniel didn't correct them. He couldn't, because it was true. Lee wasn't just a student. He had become something else entirely, a spark of light in Daniel's long, dark world. Back in Belgium, Daniel had once built a life around love and plans. He and his wife, Elise, had been together for 8 years. They had bought a small house outside Ghent, painted the nursery a soft pale blue, chosen names. They tried, and waited, and tried again. When the doctors confirmed that Daniel was infertile, he felt like a glass jar cracked from the inside. Elise tried to be strong for them both, but eventually the grief between them became a wall. One cold November morning, she left. Daniel never blamed her, but he never quite recovered either. He left Europe not out of wanderlust, but out of exhaustion. He needed distance. He needed to feel useful again. He joined an international volunteer program, signed the papers, packed a single suitcase, and never looked back. When he met Lee, something shifted. The boy didn't know about Elise, or the empty nursery, or the sound of a closing door. He only knew that Daniel had time to listen to his stories, patience to fix his toys, and hands that never hit or pushed or raised in anger. One evening, under the hanging lanterns of the Mid-Autumn Festival, Lee reached up and took Daniel's hand as they watched children carry paper dragons through the street. "I wish you were my Baba," he whispered in Mandarin. Daniel didn't answer at first. His throat tightened. He squeezed the boy's hand gently and managed a quiet reply. "I'm here, aren't I?" Lee nodded. It became their silent promise. From that day, Daniel's life found a rhythm. He rose with the rooster's cry, prepared simple meals, taught the village children, and in the evenings helped Lee with homework under the warm flicker of oil lamps. Some nights they sat in the courtyard, sharing roasted peanuts and pointing at stars, inventing names for each one. "That one is Teacher Star," Lee would say, poking the sky with a finger sticky from sugarcane. "And that one is Student Star," Daniel replied, smiling. When Lee fell sick with a high fever one humid afternoon, Daniel carried him across the fields to the clinic himself. He stayed by his side through the night, wiping sweat from the boy's brow and reading to him softly in both languages. When Lee finally opened his eyes and whispered, "Teacher Dan?" Daniel cried quietly behind his glasses. The bond between them only deepened after that. Even Mr. Wu, quiet and cautious, seemed to accept the closeness. Though he rarely spoke more than a few words to Daniel, he no longer frowned when Lee ran to him, or when Daniel lifted the boy onto his shoulders for their evening walks. One Sunday morning, as the monsoon rain came down in silver sheets, Lee sat by the window drawing with crayons. He held up the paper proudly. It was a family. 3 stick figures. A tall one with glasses, a small one with a smile, and a third figure, faintly drawn and surrounded by clouds. "Who's this?" Daniel asked gently. "That's my mama," Lee said. "She went to heaven when I was small." Daniel nodded. He placed a hand on the boy's head. "And the tall one?" he asked. Lee looked up, surprised. "That's you. You're my family now." The afternoon sun filtered through the banyan trees, casting dappled gold on the dusty courtyard. Daniel had returned early from the market in the neighboring town. He carried a small cloth bag filled with storybooks, a paper kite, and a handful of ripe, sweet oranges, Lee's favorite. When he reached the compound, Lee wasn't playing in his usual spot by the fountain. Daniel asked a neighbor, who pointed toward Mr. Wu's home. "He's resting," she said. "He played too much earlier." Daniel nodded, made his way to the small house, and knocked softly on the door. It was May, Lee's stepmother, who answered. May was a slender woman in her late 30s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that rarely smiled. She had arrived in the compound a year after Daniel, and was known for her curt words and distant demeanor. No one in the village could say much about her, except that she married Mr. Wu quietly and claimed to care for his son. Daniel offered a polite smile. "I brought some oranges for Lee. From the mountain market, he loves them." May looked at the bag for a second too long before nodding stiffly. "He's sleeping. I'll give them to him when he wakes up." Daniel hesitated. "I could come back." "I said I'll give them to him," she said more firmly. He handed over the bag. "Thank you." That evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple and the cicadas began to hum, a scream shattered the calm. "Lie!" Daniel shot up from his chair and ran. The villagers followed the cries to Mr. Wu's house. Inside, chaos reigned. Lai lay on the bamboo mat, his small body thrashing violently, his mouth foaming. Mai was crouched beside him, shrieking. Mr. Wu tried to steady the boy, but his hands trembled too much to help. Daniel pushed through the crowd, fell to his knees, and cradled Lee's head. "What happened? What?" "He's convulsing," May screamed. "It's the oranges. You poisoned my son." Daniel froze. "What? No, what are you saying?" "You gave him those oranges. You jealous, bitter foreigner. You couldn't have your own child, so you tried to kill mine." "No. May, listen to me. I would never hurt him. He's like a son to me." But her words had already taken root. The villagers, once warm and welcoming, now turned on him with suspicion etched in their faces. Daniel looked at Mr. Wu, hoping for clarity, but the older man said nothing. By the time they reached the village clinic, Lee had fallen into unconsciousness. The doctor worked quickly. Blood tests were taken. An IV line was started. The monitors beeped steadily. Hours passed. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was grave. Lee is in a coma. The poisoning came from something he ate. The toxin matches what can be found in certain citrus sprays. If not washed properly, it's deadly. The room fell silent. Daniel stepped forward. "But those oranges came from the mountain farm. I washed them before." May's voice rang out like a whip. "Liar! You brought the fruit. You brought death. You don't know what you're saying." "I saw the way you looked at him. Obsessive. Desperate. You couldn't stand not being his real father. So you did this." "No, I pleased someone. You know me." But the villagers said nothing. By nightfall, the police arrived. A young officer, unsure but bound by protocol, read Daniel his rights. His hands were cuffed. "Until we complete the investigation, you'll remain in custody," the officer said. "I'm innocent," Daniel whispered. "Please, just check the fruit. Test it." We will. But Daniel knew the truth didn't always come fast enough. In the cold, dim holding room of the local station, Daniel sat on a bamboo bench, head bowed. The silence gnawed at him louder than the village's judgment. He replayed the scene again and again. Lee's laughter, the way his eyes sparkled that morning, the way May had stared at the oranges. He buried his face in his hands. "Please don't let him die," he murmured. "Please." 1 day passed, then 2, then 5. No news came. The officer on duty brought him plain rice and water, but said little. He heard whispers, villagers debating his guilt, elders who had once smiled at him now avoiding his name. On the 7th day, just as dusk fell, the police chief entered the cell. His face gave everything away. "I'm sorry," he said. Daniel shook his head. No, don't say it. There was nothing they could do. He passed this morning." Something inside Daniel snapped. He stood up, stumbled against the wall, then slid down to the floor. His heart felt like glass crushed beneath a boot. "He called me Pa?" Daniel whispered. I never. The police chief left him alone. That night, rain came down hard, hammering the tin roof above him. Daniel stared at the ceiling, remembering the night Lee had held his hand during the festival, when he had said, "I wish you were my Baba." Daniel had smiled then. Now all he could see was the boy's face, pale and still. Back in the village, the atmosphere was heavy. Some people muttered that the foreigner had shown his true face at last. Others weren't so sure. The children cried in quiet corners, confused. One girl asked her mother, "If Teacher Dan is bad, why did he teach us for free?" No one had an answer. May, draped in white robes of mourning, wept publicly. But behind her sobs there was something, too practiced, too loud. Mr. Wu said little. He told the villagers that he would take Lee's body to his ancestral home for burial. He didn't invite May. Nor Daniel, of course. As the body was prepared, Mr. Wu made a quiet visit to the police station. "I want him released," he said. The officers looked up, stunned. "Sir? I'm not pressing charges." But the villagers? Let them talk. Reluctantly, they uncuffed Daniel and returned his few belongings. A notebook, a carved bird, and a photograph of Lee wearing a paper crown. "Mister?" Wu waited outside. "I'm taking my son to the countryside," he said quietly. "Come with me." Daniel's voice was hoarse. Why? Because someone needs to say goodbye. Too stunned to argue, Daniel followed. They traveled in silence, winding through foggy hills and bamboo forests. Daniel braced for the moment he would have to see Lee one last time, to say words that no child should ever hear. But the car didn't stop at any temple or cemetery. Instead, they pulled into a small house at the edge of a quiet village. And waiting at the door was Lai. Alive. The road twisted like a serpent through the jungle-covered hills. Rain tapped rhythmically against the windshield, and the scent of wet earth seeped into the car. Daniel sat beside Mr. Wu in silence, trying to decipher where they were going. Something felt off. "This isn't the way to the city temple," Daniel finally said, his voice low. Mr. Wu didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed on the winding road. "We're not going to the temple," he said. Daniel turned sharply. "Then where? You'll see." Dread coiled in Daniel's chest. After all he'd been through, the humiliation, the prison, the accusation, was this another twist of betrayal? Was Mr. Wu luring him into some remote place to take revenge? The car slowed as they entered a remote village, surrounded by mist-draped hills. The air was cooler here. Time seemed slower. They turned down a narrow path lined with banana trees, where an old wooden house stood at the edge of a rice field. "This is my father's house," Mr. Wu said, stepping out. Daniel hesitated, then followed. His shoes crunched on gravel as they approached the creaky front porch. Before Daniel could ask another question, the door opened, and a small voice cried out, "Palooka!" Daniel froze. There, standing in the doorway, was Le. Alive, smiling, running toward him. For a moment, the world blurred. Time stopped. Daniel fell to his knees as Lai crashed into his arms, hugging him tightly. Daniel stammered, eyes wide. "You're alive. How is this?" "I missed you," burying his face in Daniel's shoulder. Daniel looked up at Mr. Wu, speechless. Inside, they sat at a simple wooden table. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of an old clock and the soft rustle of wind outside. "You deserve to know the truth," Mr. Wu said. Daniel listened as the story began to unfold, darker, more twisted than he could have ever imagined. "Lee is my only child," Mr. Wu began. "His mother, my first wife, was a gentle woman. She died when Lee was barely 1 year old. At least, that's what everyone believed. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Mr. Wu sighed. Her death was never natural. She was poisoned. But no one suspected it then. Not even me. It was May, our housemaid, who helped me raise Lee after my wife passed. She was kind, or so I thought. When Lee turned 2, I married May. Not out of love, but necessity. Daniel's hands clenched. Mr. Wu continued. She was never cruel in front of me, but I later learned that behind closed doors she resented Lee, treated him coldly, sometimes worse. I thought she was just distant. Well, I was blind. Daniel looked at Lee, who sat on the floor quietly, playing with a carved wooden horse. I didn't begin to suspect anything, Mr. Wu said, until last week when Lee was in the hospital. One of the nurses approached me in private. He paused, as if the memory was difficult to relive. She said, "Is that boy truly her son?" I told her yes, she helped raise him. The nurse looked at me and said, "Then be careful." I saw something. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The nurse saw May in the room late one night. The machines monitoring Lee were beeping softly. She was alone with him, leaning over him, speaking softly but cruelly. The nurse thought it odd, so she came in. May pretended to be adjusting the IV, but something didn't feel right. Mr. Wu got up, walked to a cabinet, and retrieved a small black device, a camera. "She installed this?" Daniel asked. "I did," Mr. Wu said. "With the nurse's help. We had to be sure." He pressed play. Daniel heard May's voice, clear, sharp, laced with venom. "You'll never have what my girls deserve. Your mother took everything, but not you. I'll make sure you're forgotten and no one will suspect me. That foolish foreigner will take the blame." Daniel's mouth went dry. There was a pause, then a soft sound, May laughing bitterly. "You call him Palooka? Good. Then they'll believe he did it. Let the world mourn a poisoned boy. My daughters will inherit your father's house, not you." Mr. Wu shut off the recording. Silence stretched between them. "So," Daniel whispered, "she tried to kill him and frame me." "She almost succeeded," Mr. Wu said. Lee slipped into a coma, but the poison wasn't fatal, just enough to make him fall ill. The nurse recognized the signs quickly. "We had hours." Daniel stared at the table. "And you let them tell the world he was dead?" "I had to," Mr. Wu said. "If I hadn't, she would have tried again, or disappeared. I told the doctor to report Lee's death. I told May that I would bury him alone in my ancestral home. She believed me." "Why release me?" "Because I knew she'd push too far if she thought she'd won. I needed time, and you needed to see the truth with your own eyes." Daniel looked at Lee again, who had quietly crept into his lap. The boy rested his head on Daniel's chest, whispering, "I knew you didn't hurt me." Daniel fought tears. She murdered your wife," he said softly to Mr. Wu, "and almost your son." "Yes," Mr. Wu said, his jaw clenched. "But now I have her confession, recorded, stored, copied, and I've already submitted it to the authorities." "And Lee?" Daniel asked. "What happens to him now? I want you to raise him," Mr. Wu said, standing. "I've failed to protect him more than once, but you've never failed him, not even when everyone turned on you." Daniel was stunned. "You're his father. I will always be his father, but I'm not the man he needs every day. You are." A heavy silence settled. Daniel nodded. "I'll protect him," he said. "Always." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting orange light across the fields, Daniel and Lee sat on the porch of the old house. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. A dog barked in the distance. Lee leaned against him. "Will we go back to the village?" he asked. Daniel looked down. "Soon, but this time we'll return with the truth." "Will the bad lady go away?" Daniel wrapped an arm around him. "Yes, and you won't have to be afraid again." In the darkness, the shadows had lifted, at least for now. But Daniel knew the final chapter was still waiting, and this time he would face it head-on. When Daniel and Mr. Wu returned to Maylan Village, the air was tense with whispers. Word had spread like wildfire. Lee was alive, and the foreign teacher falsely accused of murder had returned, not in shame, but with evidence. Real evidence. Enough to tear down a house of lies. The next morning, 2 officers from the provincial capital arrived with solemn expressions and a court order in hand. Daniel stood at a distance near the courtyard gate, holding Lee's small hand. The boy was quiet, his dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Mr. Wu walked ahead and pointed to the house at the end of the courtyard. May stood at the doorway, a robe loosely tied around her, pretending to mourn. But when she saw the officers and Daniel standing behind them with Lee beside him, her face paled. At first, she tried to run. 2 neighbors blocked her path. "You said he died," one woman muttered. "You even cried in our arms." "You used the village," another spat. "For what? Property?" As May was handcuffed, she screamed, tears now real, but no longer out of grief. "I did everything for my daughters. I gave that child a home." But Mr. Wu cut her off. "You gave him fear and pain. You tried to take what was never yours." At the police station, May finally confessed everything. She had murdered Mr. Wu's first wife out of jealousy and ambition. When Lee began to grow and show signs of affection from the villagers and Daniel, her fear of being cut out of the inheritance grew. The oranges had been her plan to shift suspicion, rid herself of the child, and let the world blame Daniel. But greed, like smoke, never stays hidden forever. The court sentenced her to life in prison. The courtroom was quiet as the verdict echoed against its walls. Daniel sat in the back, Lee curled up beside him, half asleep. Justice had been done, yet the ache of what they had endured couldn't be erased so easily. But healing, Daniel knew, had already begun. The seasons turned. In spring, the fields of Maylin bloomed with golden rapeseed and cherry blossoms. The village, once divided by doubt, slowly began to return to peace. Daniel resumed his teaching. Children once again lined the school porch with their sandals and shouted his name when they spotted him from afar. But one thing had changed forever. He was no longer just Teacher Dan. He was now Papa Luca, Lee's guardian, his safe place. Mr. Wu, quieter than ever, devoted his time to tending the fields and reading ancient poetry. His regret for marrying May was deep, but he found comfort in Lee's laughter again, and in watching the bond between his son and Daniel grow even stronger. In late summer, Daniel found himself spending more time with Lan, Mr. Wu's younger sister. A woman in her early 30s, Lan was graceful, soft-spoken, and known in the village for her healing herbs and warm hands. She had been one of the few people who had always believed Daniel was innocent. She had brought him food during his detainment. She had wept quietly when the village turned against him. And now, she smiled when he came by, always pretending it was just to buy tea leaves. Their relationship unfolded slowly, like jasmine in morning dew. Unspoken kindness, shared silences, moments of laughter with Lee between them. One cool evening, as the moon rose over the rice fields and the fireflies danced, Daniel asked her, "Do you think a man who has known loss can still be someone's beginning?" Lan looked at him, her eyes deep and steady. "You were never the ending," she said. "You were always the seed." They were married under the great banyan tree at the edge of the village. There were no grand decorations, no expensive silks, just neighbors who came bearing flowers and drums, children who ran barefoot through the fields, and Mr. Wu standing with pride as he held Lee's hand and placed it in Daniel's. That winter, Lan gave birth to a baby boy. When Daniel held his son for the first time, he felt something shatter and heal, all at once. His voice trembled as he whispered the baby's name, Jorin, meaning light after rain in Lan's dialect. He remembered the empty nursery back in Belgium, the aching silence. Now, all around him, there was noise and color and warmth and love. On the anniversary of May's arrest, Daniel stood before his students, older now, wiser, and curious as ever. He held a small lesson not on language, but on life. "Do you know what destroys families?" he asked them. The children shook their heads. "Greed," he said simply. "It turns love into chains and blinds people to what they already have." A little girl raised her hand. "And what saves them?" Daniel smiled. "Kindness and the courage to keep loving, even after the world turns against you." Lee, sitting in the front row, looked up at him with quiet pride. After class, the village elder came to Daniel with a scroll. It was hand-painted, with old calligraphy that read, "Compassion may bend, but it never breaks. Greed may grow, but it always falls." Daniel hung it in his home, not as a warning, but as a promise. Years later, long after the courtroom doors had closed and May's name was forgotten, the village still told the story of the foreign teacher who became a father. A man who once had nothing, who lost his country, his marriage, and his hope, and who found in a dusty village far from home a child who called him Pa, a woman who called him beloved, and a home he never expected. The tale wasn't about tragedy, nor about betrayal. It was about the victory of gentle hearts over cunning minds, and how in the end, love does not arrive in grand gestures, but in small, patient acts of courage, offering a child an orange, even when the world is bitter. If this story touched your heart, there are many more waiting to be told. On this channel, we share emotional tales of love, loss, hope, and redemption, from quiet villages to distant lands. Every week, a new journey, a new voice, a new lesson. So if you believe in the power of storytelling to heal and inspire, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we live in silence, until someone dares to tell them.